Well, as we have mentioned, this is International Women's Day. And to mark the day, Daughters of the Vote, an event organized by Equal Voice, brought together 338 young women and gender diverse youth from every federal riding in Canada. 34 of them had the chance to speak to a simulated virtual sitting of the House of Commons today. The multi-partisan program aimed at getting more women elected to legislatures across the country, including the House of Commons, where less than 100 of the MPs are women now. The Daughters of the Vote delegates spoke about the issues they believe are important, perhaps issues that are overlooked, and their lived experiences and their visions for a better Canada. Two of those young women are with me now. Let me introduce them to you. Mirabelle Harris-Eze is a law student, the delegate for Calgary-Signal Hill, and Julia Hutlet is pursuing a Juris Doctor degree. She is the delegate for Winnipeg North. Thank you both for taking time to speak with me today. Great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Mirabelle, let me start with you. Let me start by asking you, what drove you to take an interest in Daughters of the Vote and to become more involved in the political process?
Yeah, definitely. So I've always had the belief that representation matters. And when you look at the House of Commons, commonality is meant to mean everyone. It's meant to mean that it represents the entirety of Canada and it's everyone's house. And so when the House of Commons doesn't look like Canada, that's a problem because there's different voices that are just marginalized and aren't allowed to be part of the conversation, or there's just gaps that inherently are just going to arise. And so for me, learning about this process meant learning more about how I can make my parliament look more like Canada, learning more about how I can ensure that marginalized communities' voices are being uplifted, how I can ensure that my communities have a seat at the table too. And so that was a big part of that. And also just learning more about how to increase representation of women in politics, because it's been a century or decades since women have been afforded the right to vote, and yet we still are not making up 50% of the parliament. And I think that that's a huge issue. And so I wanted to learn about how to address that as well.
Julia, what motivated you to be part of this process for change to see more women in politics?
I wanted to become part of the Daughters of the Vote because I've noticed in my writing as well that it doesn't look as it should in regards to Parliament. So I wanted to inspire other Indigenous women to run for office. And I feel like it's important for me as an Indigenous woman, for other Indigenous women in my community to see themselves as it's possible to be in the House of Commons, even if it's virtual.
Right. Mirabelle, you spoke in your remarks today, you spoke about the need to affect change here and justice reform and the need to deal with incarceration rates in this country. What needs to change and how do you make that change occur?
Yeah, definitely. And so that's a really big question. I don't necessarily know if I have all the answers, but I do know that there definitely needs to be more diversity across the board when it comes to police forces, when it comes to the legal practice, the judiciary, juries, everyone involved, and I guess making sure that justice happens in this country. When those spaces aren't being filled with, when those spaces don't represent the entirety of Canada, there's things that propagate and there's systemic prejudice that propagates, maybe not even necessarily knowingly on the behalf of certain people, but it gets to the point that when it happens over and over again, there's certain things that happen. And you look at it when you look at how Indigenous people make up maybe 5% of the population, and yet over 30% of those incarcerated. And same with Black communities, 3% of the population and 8% of those federally incarcerated. And you look at that and you can't say that Black and Indigenous people are inherently more deviant or criminal, because we don't live in a vacuum, and there's serious work that needs to be done in terms of making that those statistics not be the reality. And so what I'm asking or calling on the government to do is to really talk with these communities and look at how can we address, disproportionate policing and the violence and ways in which that's engaged with marginalized communities, looking at justice reform in terms of applying critical race theory to different policies, and getting disaggregated data so you can make more actionable, policy decisions. There's so many different.
But these are things you really can only make happen if you get into what I guess I call the system. There's a lot of reasons. Julia, let me ask you. You suggested you want more Indigenous women to become involved in politics, but for many marginalized communities in this country, federal politics in particular is a big giant turnoff. They don't feel that politicians speak for them. How do you make that pivot? How do you get people to understand, look, the only way that change happens is if we see us represented in that federal political system. That's how the change occurs from inside. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's an interesting observation. It is important to note that politics in Canada is a colonial institution. The House of Commons is a settler colonial institution. So it's not that Indigenous people don't want to be in the House of Commons, it's that it wasn't built for us as Indigenous people. So it's important for Canadians to make room and notice that Indigenous voices need to be heard, even in Parliament, in legislatures, in the Supreme Court of Canada. It's so important for these voices to be heard. And I wouldn't say that it's because we don't want to be there. We do want to be there. But Indigenous people in Canada have they are statistically lower socioeconomic statuses, which means that we don't have the same funding. We can't have extraordinary funded campaigns like some other MPs can. Equal Voice has a school for female politicians who want to run, who don't know how to run. I had the opportunity to attend the Indigenous Forum on Thursday with Equal Voice. And several of the MPs mentioned that they didn't have the same funding as other MPs in their ridings. And I think that that's just the disadvantage of it. I wouldn't say that we don't want to be in Parliament at all.
Okay, the time's kind of short, but let me ask you this. So you've now gone through the process of Daughters of the Vote. What's it done to your desire, your appetite to want to take this further and actually maybe take the next big step at some point and run for elected office? Or has it made you question that possibility at all? Mirabelle, let me start with you.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm not 100% sure right now whether I do want to run or not. I can say that the conference has left me more willing to entertain that reality. And I think, the truth is I'm 22 and I'm still in law school and I'm still trying to figure everything out. But I do know that I'm a lot more confident about that possibly becoming a reality because I've seen so many, different amazing women that are become involved in politics and, taken that risk and thrown their hat in the ring. So I'm not sure is really the short story, but I am a lot more confident about potentially doing it in the future.
All right, Julia, how about you?
I know that I do want to be involved, and I've known that from the start. As another law student, I still am on the path of figuring that out, but I do think it's important for us BIPOC folks to get our voices out there. And I think that if it's not in politics, it probably will be as a judge.
All right, well, we're going to watch. We expect big things from both of you, no matter where you make your mark, but surely you'll make a mark somewhere. And thanks for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.